Welcome to another 3 Minute Therapy podcast. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. I'm a clinical psychologist and author. I've been practicing rational emotive behavior therapy, REBT, for 40 years. And I'm joined with my co-author, Dr. David Ramsey Steele. We wrote 3 Minute Therapy, and we also wrote another book called Therapy Breakthrough. Today, we're going to be discussing self-esteem, and self-esteem is a much confused concept in the literature and among therapists, and REBT has a somewhat unique, but I think very powerful view of self-esteem. So starting with the basics, feeling high or low self-esteem are feelings or emotions, and our emotions don't come from situations like I won the race or a beautiful woman loves me, but it comes from our thinking about those situations. It's always our views, attitudes, beliefs, the ideas in our head that cause our emotions, never situations themselves. So applying that to self-esteem, if you have high self-esteem, it's because you feel good about yourself, and you generally feel good about yourself because you did certain things well. You got a raise at work, you got married, you won the race. So you did these things well in your estimation, and then you decided because of that, you are a good person. But the problem here is it violates that basic principle of emotions, which is it's not these things that cause our high self-esteem, but rather it's our thinking about them. And one way to put it is we rate the situations. I get a raise, that's situation, and I rate it. That's good. And then I rate my entire self based on the rating of the situations. And that's a problem for many reasons. It's an overgeneralization, doesn't follow logically, it doesn't work, it tends to lead to anxiety in the future about not doing well and maintaining your self-esteem. So there are various problems with self-esteem. In our book that David and I wrote, 3 Minute Therapy, we have an entire chapter on self-esteem, and we call it Self-Esteem, the Feel Good About Yourself Trap. So if you do have high or low self-esteem, then the solution is not rating your total self based on the rating of your actions, but rather unconditionally accepting yourself as the imperfect human you are. Whether you do well or poorly, or people love you or hate you, you're still the same imperfect human through all that. And you're always going to act imperfectly because as a human, you have an imperfect brain, imperfect knowledge, can't achieve perfection or get guarantees. So you're always going to do less than what you may wish to do. But if you accept yourself unconditionally, that's just a practical problem, not just an emotional problem. So laying the groundwork, David, did you want to add anything to the basic idea of self-esteem and unconditional self-acceptance before we discuss some of the misconceptions?
Yes, well, one aspect of this is that in the United States in the 70s and 80s, there was a huge wave of preoccupation with self-esteem. And the whole idea was that if you have a class of school kids and you're trying to teach them math, it's a good idea to make them feel they're really great at math. And the result of that, was tested in various bits of research, which showed that American students are the highest in the world of what they think of their abilities in these various academic subjects like mathematics. but they're among the lowest in the world at actual achievement in these subjects. So that was the result of this sort of self-esteem, preoccupation with self-esteem. I remember that there was a guy called Nathaniel Branden who wrote several books about self-esteem, and they sold a lot and made him rich, presumably. Well, those books basically, they basically adopted a Freudian approach, except that instead of sex, it was all about self-esteem. But apart from that, all the Freudian apparatus, like repressed memories and all that sort of stuff, unconscious motivations that you don't know anything about, all that was reproduced. But instead of being all based on childhood fantasies of sex, it was all based on how your parents treated you and gave you low self-esteem. It's quite comical, really. And I don't suppose anybody reads Nathaniel Branden anymore. Another aspect of this is that if you read, I did read Nathaniel Branden's books. The first one was quite interesting, and the subsequent ones were very shallow. If you read those, he never ever utters a single sentence about the dangers of excessive self-esteem. But we know that from research into psychopaths and serial killers and criminals who routinely hurt other people and create a lot of violence and trouble, that these people typically have high self-esteem. The paradox was that when these people come in for treatment or therapy or counseling, the therapist tries to increase their self-esteem, but they've got too much self-esteem. That's why they're psychopaths. They need to be told that they're not all that important. That's what I feel about that.
Yeah. You mentioned Nathaniel Branden, the psychologist who wrote volumes about self-esteem. One of his books is called The 6 Pillars of Self-Esteem. So he mentions 6 things if you achieve, you earn or you have self-esteem. And interestingly enough, and to show how confused he was, one of those pillars was self-acceptance. Now, if you accept yourself unconditionally, then that's the final achievement. You don't need high or low self-esteem to muddy the waters. You just accept yourself unconditionally. If you do well or you do poorly, you're still the same person. So your ego's not on the line when you do things, or when you're trying to win your boss's approval, or a woman you're courting's approval. But what's on the line is whether you're doing well or doing poorly. And then if you're doing poorly, you can try to figure out why and do better. And if you're doing well, you could try to figure out why and maintain that. But if you muddy it with high self-esteem or low self-esteem, that means it's a failing you or a succeeding you as a total person. And that really doesn't direct you in terms of what to do to change. So that's another problem with the self-esteem concept. There's one criticism, the main criticism I get about this concept when I explain it to people is that it increases complacency. Because if you're just an imperfect human who acts imperfectly, why try to improve? Because if you improve, you're still the same imperfect human who acts imperfectly. Well, the reason is when you have unconditional self-acceptance, part of that is you still have goals. You're an imperfect human with goals in your life, and you'd like to achieve those goals. So that avoids complacency, because now you have the cobweb of self-esteem out of the way, and you can work toward achieving those goals. So it's quite the opposite of complacency. And this one of the studies that David was alluding to earlier, where there was one specific one where students, high school students from different countries, Korea, Spain, Britain, and the US, were given two tests. One is I am good at math or I'm not good at math. And the other one was a math test. And the ones who said they were good at math presumably had high self-esteem. That's why they thought they were good at math. And students from the U.S. were one of the groups that scored very high. I'm good at math, and they did the worst at math. And ironically, the Korean students who said they weren't so good at math did the best on math. So they weren't so complacent. So it's the idea of self-esteem as a general concept, high or low, which is more likely to lead to complacency than looking at one's goals. What are you trying to achieve in a particular situation? And then are your behaviors, your actions helping you achieve those goals? Okay, David, those were pretty much the points I wanted to make. Anything else you wanted to say?
Yeah, well, just following up on this idea that very unpleasant people usually have very high self-esteem. It's characteristic of what we call psychodynamic therapy, which is ultimately descends from Freud, that it attributes to people the opposite of what they express. So if somebody seems very confident and upbeat, the psychodynamic therapist says, oh, this must be concealing some terrible self-loathing, or that they really hate themselves, and this is their way they compensate for it. Well, that's one of the many crazy ideas in Freudianism and in psychodynamic therapy. If people seem of course, it's possible that somebody could have a lot of self-doubt and cover it up by being extremely upbeat. But generally speaking, people actually feel the way they seem. That's the first rule. And the whole idea that there's a deficiency of self-esteem in the world that can be cured by teaching people to feel better about themselves, is I think just a big fallacy. And I would say that some people listening to this, it occurs to me, might have difficulty in following what we're saying. What we're saying is that your behavior is not part of yourself. It's something external to you that you can observe, and you can change. You can intervene in your behavior and change it. But when you do something that has an unfortunate outcome, it's not helpful to think, oh dear, I screwed up. That's not a helpful way to think about it. The more helpful way to think about it is, that didn't go so well. Maybe I could try a different pattern of behavior in the future.
I might have a different view. Maybe we can have a bit of a discussion about that. So you said, David, your behavior is not part of yourself. Now, it depends on how you define yourself. But I think one definition that I've heard actually from Albert Ellis of oneself is everything that can be attributed to you, past, present, and future. All those things go to make up yourself. Now, that makes some sense to me. So in that case, your behavior, I would put it a little differently. I wouldn't say, I would agree, not part of yourself, but I'd say your behavior is an aspect of you, yourself, in the sense that you do the behavior, you're responsible for the behavior. If I run, for example, my running and myself are not totally disengaged. I'm doing it, but it's not a defining, it doesn't define me. So that's my thought about that. Did you have comments on that?
Well, I don't really disagree with what you've just said. I do disagree with the idea that yourself is past, present, and future. There are certain aspects of myself which are quite different to what they were 30 or 40 years ago. So I don't think the way I was 30 or 40 years ago is part of myself today, although of course there is a causal connection and there is a continuity. I'm not sure that we do have a disagreement. Maybe if we talked at great length, we would find a disagreement, which would be always good, because disagreement is more productive than agreement. But I'm not sure there is a disagreement here.
Yeah.
I think that I'm just trying to put it as strongly as possible when I say that your behavior is not part of yourself. It's not part of your inner essence, put it that way. It's just something that happened. Each bit of behavior is something that happened once. It can be looked at. You can control it. You can do something different next time, or you can do something the same the next time. That's under your control to a great extent, not totally, but to a great extent. And it's perfectly reasonable to say, I've noticed that I'm engaging in this sort of behavior, and it might be a good idea to try and change it. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to say. And I think we both agree on that.
Yes, yes. And maybe this would be a good subject for a future podcast. Uh, what is the self? How we define the self? Is the self definable? Those kinds of issues we can explore. But thank you very much, David, for joining me in this podcast on self esteem and an REBT view of self esteem. And again, David is Dr. David Ramsey Steele, co author of 3 Minute Therapy. I'm Dr. Michael Edelstein. The other side of the authorship on 3 Minute Therapy, clinical psychologist. And there's a website called 3minutetherapy.com where you can learn more about it. And 3 is always the word spelled out, not the number. And also, I'd like to thank Chris Rossini, without whose help these podcasts wouldn't be possible. Chris is in the background working the digitals. So that's why we're able to bring these podcasts to you. If you enjoyed the podcast, please give us a like and subscribe to 3 Minute Therapy podcast. Throw a tip into the Patreon tip jar to support us, and come to future episodes, and tune into 3 Minute Therapy podcast and read 3 Minute Therapy to stay on the rational side of life.